Now we're going to transition to our panel on ethics. So our panelists, if you can make your way up, we're also being joined by a panelist online, so we're pulling that together right now. As AI tools rapidly reshape how we conduct research, we're confronted not only with many questions, but also a renewed sense of responsibility. Questions raised during earlier technological disruptions, such as the shift to networked and collaborative computing, many of which have not been fully resolved, things like data privacy, data security, are now returning with urgency now that AI is with us. New questions are also emerging about how we ensure transparency and fairness, and how we protect human subjects when the tools themselves are evolving faster than our ability to make policy around them. SF State is a leader in AI ethics, amongst other things. Today's panel takes the broad topic of AI ethics and turns it inward, bringing together leading voices from our campus who are seeking to address key institutional questions. Please join us in welcoming our panelists. Can you flip that on? Zainab Agha, Assistant Professor, Department of Computer Science. Chris Koenig, Professor, Department of Communication Studies and Chair of the Institutional Review Board. Sepideh Modrek, Professor in the Department of Economics and Assistant Chair of the Institutional Review Board. And Carlos Montemayor, Professor and Chair, Department of Philosophy. I'm going to hand it off to our panel. Carlos, you can start us off.
Okay, sorry. Thank you all for coming. I will try to be very brief. I think the issues that were raised in the previous talk are incredibly important. We need to be more thoughtful as a university, but also educational institutions need to be more thoughtful about AI, and that hasn't happened really. So we can really be a leader in that debate, at least, and in many other aspects. So I started working a little bit on AI. My areas are philosophy of mind and philosophy of psychology. I also worked a little bit with Ezekiel Morcella on consciousness. One aspect that being thoughtful about AI in education really matters is the way the technology is being deployed is as a way of making our lives easier, right? Saving time, finding shortcuts, making research more expeditious. But the problem is, as Professor Gurev was pointed out, is that AI lacks motivations, right? And education is not finding shortcuts and making our lives easier. It's finding the purpose and motivation of what we're doing in general. And as educators, we cannot pretend that we will replace finding our purpose and our motivations as educators with a technology that is literally a tool. This is not the way that the industry presents it. The way the industry presents it is as a replacement of human thought. Actually, the dream is to replace all kinds of human skills with this technology. And of course, for education, that is incompatible with our goals. And also, it's unrealistic, right? So you don't go to universities to find your way to shortcut throughout the entire array of problems. You want to live a meaningful life where your goals are clearly meaningful to you and valuable to you. So it is a very real question, how to find a thoughtful way to incorporate AI in education in a way that our values and goals are not destroyed in the way of incorporating this technology. And that debate, I don't think, has started really between universities and the public. It should be a public debate. It cannot be a bunch of empresarios and their billions of dollars determining how this is going to happen. It cannot come from government unilaterally. It needs to be a horizontal conversation among universities, and that's not taking place. I've seen this because I've been part of the ethical AI graduate certificate with computer science and the College of Business, and we are in the middle of two of the big pipeline institutions that send a lot of engineers to Silicon Valley, Stanford and Berkeley, and I haven't seen any conversation in these directions. I mean, there's a lot of talk, obviously, about how AI is transformative and going to change our lives and our future, but very little about how to be thoughtful about it. So I'm just in resonance to the previous talk. Another important aspect of this is that San Francisco State could be, I mean, we are the College of San Francisco, and at least 3 of the leading companies benefit from being in San Francisco, from the resources of the city, from the high intellectual activity of the city. And being the College of San Francisco, we're uniquely positioned to be the leading voice of the CSU on this issue. Like, I think we should not just represent our campus, we should represent our colleges, the CSU colleges. And I know a lot of colleagues in other CSUs who are very worried about this. We should also highlight what is good about AI. I think the previous talk also really did a good job about that. But there's a lot, I mean, so there's an overcompensation mechanism here. There's an overemphasis on how this is going to be good, and very little discussion on the harms that could emerge from applying this technology across the board. There's a lot about how it's already affecting mental health, but there's very little about how the replacement of skills could affect educational experiences. So ideally, we should meet regularly, and those of us who work on this issue should talk more among ourselves, and hopefully at some point create an initiative, an AI initiative that results in some kind of document with concrete guidelines, because again, that also doesn't exist. And if we take the companies as a model of guidelines, those guys are like the worst example you can take, right? Because they, for example, Anthropic destroyed a bunch of books. And some of the behavior that they do is incredibly unethical. So we can't look at them as models of ethical behavior. So we need to develop those guidelines, and we need to develop them thinking in our students, their future, and our institution, its goals and values. That's it. Thank you.
What about now? Okay, hi. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Nice to see you all. I'm Chris Koenig. I serve as chair for the IRB. I'm going to take a much smaller scope than what Carlos just outlined. And as you all know, the field of ethics is a huge philosophical area, and in the Institutional Review Board Committee, we are more concerned with what I would call procedural ethics when it comes to research with human participants, which is really, really small by comparison. So we're, I think Sep and myself are really going to be talking a little bit more about some of the applied aspects of ethics when it comes to research in AI. And we're going to just basically talk about some of the things that we've seen on the committee so far in the last year, because that's really when things really started to heat up in general. One of the things that you might imagine is it's not that easy to put together an ethics proposal. There's a lot of moving parts when proposing research with human participants, and so one of the really nice things that AI can help with is to come up with language for the protocols, and so we're seeing a lot of protocols by both faculty and students that reflect aspects of AI, and it's really clear when you see a protocol that's incorporated some AI language, and I think for most faculty, I think that we're fairly sophisticated writers and revisers, and we know what that gig is like to revise text again and again to sort of for an output to use the AI language in ways that are convergent with what our goals are, which is to get through the committee and to proceed on to the research. For students, on the other hand, they're less experienced, and so for some student protocols, it's clear that that they're using AI to help to write various sections, but they're not really revising them, and so some of the language is cluttered, that turns up in protocols, that is then not revised or reviewed by faculty, and then passed along to the committee for in a quote revise and resubmit type situation. Our committee is not really set up for revise and resubmit. It's not really the goal for our committee. It's really more around making sure that the ethical guidelines set by the federal guidelines governing research on human participants are followed. So in this first point, just to say that I'm not a hater on AI. I think it's a useful tool, but it's not alone. It needs supervision and it needs revision. And not only students need help in training for how to use it for various purposes, including writing protocols, but faculty also, are responsible for making sure that when protocols are composed by AI, that they're reviewed and that they're vetted to make sure that the goals of the study are consistent and convergent with the federal guidelines, as well as respect for the human participants that will ultimately be the participants that generate our research that's so important. So I think that's kind of the first point, is just around the responsibility. It's an ethical responsibility, not only for students, but also for faculty, to ensure that those products are consistent with the highest research standards in the various fields that we're working in on the campus. So that's the first thing. A second thing is there's been, so we've, in various ways, the wonderful IRB staff has really helped to help to push this and help us to understand these points. But it's also become clear that both faculty and students who already have data collected, let's say, either quantitative or qualitative interviews, focus groups, that kind of thing, folks are uploading research data into AI, and sometimes using them for generating analyses. And while in principle that could happen, and that might be something that could happen in the future, pre-existing data that are already collected have not been discussed or consented by participants for upload into these systems. And this is not just something the students do, even though they do it, but faculty have also done it. And I think there's not really an awareness of, because our current arrangement, which is, as I understand it, a one-year arrangement with OpenAI for access to ChatGPT, it's not really clear how those data are used, how they're retained. Like I think Sep has looked pretty carefully, and it's not really the user agreements are not that clear on how they're retained, how they might be used, even though they're supposedly quote in a closed environment for educational use. Pre-existing data, technically should be reconsented if it's going to be uploaded and used by, into an AI environment. And that's, I mean, again, kind of to Carlos's point, we don't really have those procedures in place yet. And other universities have been more on the cutting edge, I would say, of under what conditions that pre-existing data can be used and uploaded for use for preliminary analyses. We're thinking about that. I think Carlos's call is absolutely right that we need to be talking about this. We need to have some guidelines on the committee. We've begun to have some discussions around what guidelines might be useful for the research community on campus. We haven't come to conclusions about those yet. We're a deliberative body in that way. But all to say is both quantitative and qualitative data, are protected by the federal regulations, and unless they are explicitly consented by participants for use and upload for a large language model, that they shouldn't be used in that way. And so what the question is, well, under what conditions can they be used? And maybe along the lines that Dr. Suri pointed along is like thought experiments and, well, if I had these preliminary data or these preliminary findings, maybe that's like a way that might be, possible to think about that. But, even generating preliminary coding schemes or categorization protocols in various ways might be a useful way for doing that. But that's sort of without using and uploading those private data that haven't been consented for use in those ways. So I think there was one more point. But I can't remember what that is. So if I can't remember it, then I'll pass it along to my associate chair, Sep Modrek, the brilliant quantitative person.
Thank you so much. So first, I want to be really transparent. I do not consider myself an AI expert in any way. I feel like I'm a late adopter if you look at national data, and I am very slow at adopting it. I think the reason I'm here today is to really talk about the privacy issue and just general data literacy. The experience I do have is working with really rich administrative data that if you could identify, you know everything about someone's health, you know about their financials, and I've also had the experience, the not so great experience of having data taken away because we had such rich data. So I think I want to pause there and say, I'm going to piggyback on what you were saying and to say, what we're seeing happening is that people don't even know the kinds of data they have, and they're posting them. So I guess my first point would be for both qualitative and quantitative data, you should never have a machine be the first set of eyes on these data, and you think that's crazy, but that is happening. You need to stop and really understand what you have to know the risks. Maybe there are no risks. Maybe you can really move forward. But if you don't know what you have, then you don't know the risks. And then you also need to know the regulatory environment in which you're dealing with certain kinds of data. We all hear about HIPAA and FERPA. These are real binding laws that cause institutions to lose millions of dollars. And so I want to give a concrete example. So in 1999, Stanford and Mark Cullen, who I used to work with, signed a data use agreement to get data on this company, on the workers of this company called Alcoa, and we were able to amass a lot of data. And some of the data was shareable. And the reason it was shareable is because we said it was de-identified. All we had was some health data, zip code, age, and sex. And in 1999, you could argue that that was de-identified data. In 2018, you absolutely cannot argue that that's de-identified data. And so I think the other thing for us to keep in mind is context and how it's changing of what's de-identified data and what's not de-identified data. And the idea that if I can identify someone myself, the machine can do it a lot better. So maybe pause, maybe don't put this data on any machine, whether that's Google Cloud or ChatGPT. I also want to go a step further and say, is there a time where you can use these rich data to do things with them? Absolutely. You just need to know the tools that you're working with. So for example, I know these are like, this doesn't seem ethical, this seems like very nitty gritty, but I think these are the questions you have to ask yourself as you use these tools. Do you have control over the data? Do you have control of how it's stored, how it's used, how it's destroyed? If you do, and you have a version of the tool, for example, that has these safeguards, then you can think about how to move forward with the right safeguards. But I think what's happening a lot of time is that that's not happening. People are not slowing down to really think through who we're giving this data to. So for example, if you're doing qualitative work and you use a tool that says, you put up de-identified data, I will find themes for you, I will spit it back out for you, but the second you do that, I will delete that data from my data set, my repository, and that you can delete it or you can keep a version of it. That's really different than using the free form of ChatGPT. So this feels like we all know this, we just need to be reminded of this. And then I guess my last point is really on, if it's educational data and health data, stop. There are regulatory reasons why you can't just use these data the way you would on a survey on, Coke and Pepsi. This is for Rick, he always used this example of like, if you do surveys on things like Coke and Pepsi, go crazy. But if you have health and educational data, there's federal regulations, there's probably a way that you can do the research you want to do. And the IRB does not want to stop you, but you need to be mindful, you need to think about the risks, and you need to think about the safeguards. And then I guess the very last thing I'd like to say is there are so many ways that I'm using AI that I never thought I would 6 months ago. When I first started using ChatGPT, I think it was in February 2024, to look at some code, I was like, this thing is awful. It messed things up. It made me go down this rabbit hole for an hour. Forget it. I can do this better. But I think that's not the case anymore. And so I think there's lots of ways in which you can use the tools to speed up your research. If I'm not giving it actual data, but I'm asking it to code scales, please, by all means, do that. There's lots of ways for it to support our research, and the IRB will support that 110%, but it's being really thoughtful with the data.
So we're working on some of those guidelines, you know, and I think it depends on the kind of data and the domain of research in particular. I typically work with qualitative data, and so you know, among some of the data that I've worked with, we've discussed procedures for not only just anonymizing transcripts, for example, for you know identities, but and locations, or you know, after, you know, so it's kind of a multi-step process of kind of anonymizing the data for, you know, locations, names, that kind of a thing, but then generating them into PDF form so that any of the metadata might not be present. So just because we can't see it in a Word document doesn't mean that the trace isn't there. And what we don't see, the machine can see. And so generating a PDF document or possibly an RTF document, for example, might be one way to appropriately anonymize qualitative data to make sure that you know, those traces aren't really visible to, you know, machine eyes as well as to our eyes. But that's just one example that we've discussed for qualitative data in particular. But you know, we're thinking as a committee and Sepideh and the IRB staff are thinking about you know, sort of a proposed list of various kinds of best practices for using data appropriately in an AI, open AI kind of environment. So, but that's just one example.
Can I just piggyback on that? I think the tool, knowing what tool you're using and what it does with the data is also really like a secondary part. There's what you do with the data to anonymize it, but then if we had believed that these companies were benevolent and they weren't going to do anything with this data, then fine. But I think that's just a secondary consideration.
We're going to flip to our final panelists, and then we'll have time for questions.
Can you all hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Okay, awesome. Thanks everyone for sharing your thoughts. I will try to keep it brief given our tech issues, but I work and do research and teaching at an intersection of how people use technology, which is the field of human-computer interaction within computer science. So I'm in this corner where you know, I'm at an intersection of people and technology, and I also study with students how we can bring in the ethical lens. And I first want to emphasize all the points that have already been made, but bring in a student-centered perspective, given that a lot of our research is done with students. And there's so many great presentations today, so I want to start by emphasizing that yes, this is a powerful tool, and there's so many great use cases. AI is revolutionizing research, from computer science to biomedical research to accessibility. But echoing some of the previous points, I think ethics often comes as an afterthought. And when we work with our students or do research in class, outside of class, I think we need to re-emphasize the point that ethics comes in at every stage. So from defining the research problem to actually collecting the data, to analyzing, reporting it back in the research writing and publication process, where now I feel many of us are questioning the reviews we receive as being written or being AI generated. And this is where I think the critical lens of where and why are we using it, and how can we make sure that the use is ethical comes in. Carlos made a really good point about saving time, like these tools help us save time. But I want to come back to the point of it also ends up being the case that we have to put in more time or help our students realize that that's the case. For instance, if my student is doing a literature review with me, it helps organize the data really quickly, but at the same time, they have to go back and check for the hallucinated reference list, or make sure that, the reading between the lines and the patterns and connections and themes are correct and not made up by AI. So while it saves some time, you often have to add more time to make sure and verify and evaluate what it's producing for you. And I feel like nowadays, one of my concerns with students' research and personally my own as well is that we're losing that intellectual struggle a little bit because we have these tools available at our fingertips. So fewer and fewer students I see grappling with like a writer's block, or that struggle of being stuck in research where you're thinking over a problem over days sometimes, because they can just go to ChatGPT and brainstorm ideas with it, which is neither a good or a bad thing, and I'm not trying to paint it as either, but I think there is value in that human cognitive struggle that we go through in research to come to a creative idea, to come to, here's how I'm going to start my essay or paragraph, which I think we need to reinstill the importance of within our students. In my other class, which is my human-computer interaction class, we do these design-based projects. And Chris had earlier mentioned about, both Chris and Seth, inputting research data into tools for analysis. But now to some extent, maybe others have had experience with this, students, there's some cases where students might also generate human subjects data using AI tools, and which represented as human feedback, which is a very slippery slope and it's dangerous, and they're not realizing sometimes the research integrity issues behind that. So I think the value of human insight and input needs to be instilled in our students, and we have to be the ones that kind of emphasize that these tools are not neutral, and they will, present biases, and they might show discrimination in different ways, whether that's, misrepresenting who, what a STEM student looks like, or what a STEM faculty member looks like, to misrepresentation in research. A lot of these tools are built on data that's from non-English speaking backgrounds from the Western world. So it makes assumptions about people and research and ideas, even for the good use cases of like making a personalized tutor for education. We have to be mindful of what assumptions it is making about the students that it is trying to help out, and making sure that we kind of align and make students aware that we have to be mindful of the critical lens between the input and the output of AI. And then the last thing that I want to kind of leave us on is, we talk about research ethics a lot, and in my ethics war class, in the context of computer science, we bring up this question of, okay, we have the Belmont principles. Do we think that the principles of respect for person, justice, beneficence, are AI tools capable of applying them effectively as research assistants? And if we struggle with that answer, I think we have to pause and kind of reflect on where and how we're using it, given its power, given that it helps us a lot. But at the end of the day, both ourselves and students are going to be the ones responsible for the research output, not a model, not an AI tool. So I think that's one thing that we really need to hone in on when working with students.
Thank you. Now we're ready to resume with questions. So there were a few hands up. If you can put them back up again. Yes, Michael.
So question for Dr. Montemayor, and thanks to everyone for the presentation. You mentioned the importance of that the discussion has to be public, but most of what you said after that had to do with discussions within universities, between universities. How are we actually doing with the general public discussion? What should we be doing to contribute to that? And what, how do you see the public doing consensus?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question, because actually I didn't want to get too much into this in my presentation, but it came from a conversation that I had with a reporter that interviewed me twice for the San Francisco Chronicle. And he says that he has been trying to get people from the companies in San Francisco, from Stanford, from Berkeley, from other universities, try to be more open about the ethical consequences of the technology. And he says, when someone typically they don't take my call. And when someone does, they say, well, I investigate whales, and AI is awesome to track whales. And, it's going to change everything. And he's like, oh, but that's not what I'm asking. I'm not asking about your research. And so he said, well, you are at least, because I said, yeah, this is a debate that needs to begin. And SF State is the College of San Francisco, and it's a good place to start this debate. And he said, well, there's no one really doing that in the Bay Area. And the Chronicle is kind of, they would love to have more on this because these companies are here. And said, but this is something that needs to come from the universities engaging the public. It cannot come from a newspaper. So it's an excellent question. What is it that we should do or what we need to do? I think universities, public universities in particular, have a duty to engage with the public. And we haven't been able to be very good at that for a very long time because we've been thinking about budget cuts and all this stuff that is happening, right? So this, I think, is something that it would be very valuable for us to do. And I know that there's a need for it because, I didn't know how bad things are in terms of public engagement with at least the Bay Area, the people that live in the Bay Area. And for example, my students say, well, why don't you have more talks on my students in the certificate, the grad certificate on AI, why don't you have more talks on campus? I was like, well, because, we don't have funds to do that. And the ideal situation would be that this involves industry and the public, and folks like the folks at the San Francisco Chronicle. And so I do think that we if we start something like that, that could eventually turn into something much more interesting. But the initial steps need to happen. I think this event is a very nice first initial step. But what I want to emphasize is there is a need to do this, and that we have talking about the ethics of an institution. I think we do have a duty to talk about this more plainly to the public. And as educators, we need to be able to include our students in that conversation. I hope this is not too vague.
On one hand. The other hand, I have Microsoft email and a bunch of Microsoft applications. Microsoft also big player in AI. What are my ethical obligations to ascertain, somehow Microsoft's not training on my laptop contents?
I don't know the answer, but that's when we turn to AT. They have these institutional agreements. I know that if I'm using my Berkeley Gmail, it's secure. Even though it's Gmail, Berkeley has an institutional agreement with Gmail to not read through my stuff. But if I'm using my regular Gmail, it doesn't. So I think this is where we turn to our leaders and to know what safe spaces they've created for us.
So I should maybe have due diligence to ask them what their agreements are.
I would flip it around if that's okay. I think our institutions need to tell us much more clearly, and we need to ask them, because we're not the only ones asking. I think there was a survey out recently that said 58% of people who are early adopters to AI and really like AI don't know the ethical boundaries and want their institutions and the journals and all these other places to start telling us. So I think we need to ask the questions that then lead our institutions to ask the companies so that we understand better.
Michael, I want to argue that ethics goes beyond just the data privacy. And in some ways, I'm observing how AI is more ethical in many ways than a human teacher that has flaws. So for example, my AI tutor that comes with the publisher has infinite patience. It will never slip and reveal the answer to the student, but it will try to identify the concepts that are missing in the student's knowledge. It has infinite patience. Students who are residing across the ocean in different time zones can ask for help at 3 a.m. in the morning. And AI will be patient with them, unlike human teachers that sometimes have human problems, human challenges. They can highlight a piece of text in the textbook. AI tutor will explain it to them and quiz them on that. No instructor has this kind of patience 24 hours per day. So my question is, shouldn't we all discuss this? Will AI replace teachers? Can AI be better teacher than all of us?
This has come up a lot in the medical health literature. Can they replace doctors? And I think the short answer, I mean, it's an excellent point. We should use incredibly patient systems that help our students. But I think going back to Professor Suri's point, patience is part of a motivational structure in context of care. So you're very patient with people who you care about, you're less patient with people that are bothering you. These machines don't care about anything. So our students should be aware that even though it looks like they have infinite patience, we are the ones who care about them, right? I mean, because when you say the co-pilot is incredibly patient, that's an interface from a company that is making money out of this co-pilot. It's not coming from a organism that cares. I mean, education is a context of care, like the medical context. So yes, there's a lot of replacement that could be helpful to release the burden on incredibly overexploited and underpaid people. But I don't think you can fully replace the systems of care that are in place in education and medicine. But it's a good point, how to strike a balance there.